Here.
Mr. Jackson?
Here.
Mr. Whalen?
Here.
And Ms. Castillo?
Here.
And who is at the number 419-515-0506?
Brett Adams. And
Okay,
Sean
thank
Sprouse.
you. Got it, thank you. I just didn't see your picture, so I wasn't sure who that was.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear that name, Mr. Chairman.
Russ Adams and
Brett Adams and Sean Sprouse. Brett Adams and yep.
Okay. Commissioners, you have before you the minutes of our meeting of March 24, 2021. What is your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I'll move to approve those minutes as submitted. McGorry.
Thank you, Mr. McGorry. A second?
Jade Castillo, I'll second.
Mr. Chairman, it's probably not important, but I'd like to mention that what's not reflected in the minutes is I was more or less asked to look into some issues on the floodplain ordinance, and that didn't really show up in the ordinance, but I believe that's what I was asked to do, maybe informally.
And is that, are you suggesting, Mr. Zuloff, the minutes need to be amended to reflect that?
Probably not, but just raising the fact that I was, charged with that, so it probably doesn't matter.
Did you recall that? Okay.
Right.
Further discussion? Without objection, the motion will be approved. Hearing no objection, the motion is approved. Our first item of business is the amendment to the floodplain legislation. And Mr. Horstman or Mr. Holliday, are you able to provide the commission and the public with a recap of what brought us to here and a summary of the changes that are being proposed?
Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Snyder from the engineering division is on. He may be able to provide that a little bit more detail.
I didn't see Mr. Snyder was part of this meeting. It's one of the the flaws of having these online meetings. Mr. Snyder, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thanks. Yeah, so a recap for those who don't recall the last conversation we had on this, last time it was brought up. The major changes are really directed toward this standard wording. Terminology as directed to us from FEMA. Specific to us, and one of the kind of hot button amendments to this ordinance deals with the freeboard requirement that the city of Sandusky imposes additionally on top of elevations set forth, building elevations set forth by FEMA. So again, beyond that, the bulk of the changes and amendments are from a model ordinance from FEMA for municipalities in the state of Ohio.
Thank you. And you provided a very useful summary of what some of our neighbors on the water have done in terms of maintaining or dispensing with the freeboard requirement, and why some of those communities, frankly, are not comparable to ours, just given the topography that we have. And I thought that was especially helpful. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Commissioners, you may recall there was there's a little bit of history here. The City Commission started discussing this, and Mr. Zuloff, thankfully, pointed out that this was supposed to start with the Planning Commission, which is why it's in front of us, of course. And like all ordinances, it would be passed by the Planning Commission first and then subsequently by the City Commission. But I don't see any issues with it there. And then you've provided, Mr. Snyder, I think it was you provided a history of how it was that we really have not enforced this, and when it has applied, we've granted a variance or a waiver in every instance.
Correct, and that was just informational for Planning Commission.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Zula.
I was there for the original, I think it was the original floodplain ordinance. It may have been an update. It was like, must have been at least 16 years ago. And it was deemed wise at the time to put the so-called freeboard in there. It is optional. It's not required by FEMA. It's suggested as an option. I'm not saying recommended. I'm only saying suggested as an option. I believe by FEMA or was at the time. If you want to better understand the concept of freeboard, you need to only look to the definition in our ordinance, which is probably boilerplate from FEMA. Freeboard is defined as a factor of safety usually expressed in feet above the flood level for the purposes of floodplain management. Freeboard tends to compensate for many unknown factors that could contribute to flood heights greater than the height calculated for a selective size flood and for floodway conditions such as wave action, obstructed bridge openings, debris and ice jams, and hydrological effects of urbanization and watershed. So we're certainly not recommending against it. Some communities do it, some don't, some are similar. I'm not sure that it's particularly relevant that what other communities do, because I think they're kind of all over the map on whether they do it or not. Vermilion doesn't have it, they're lakeshore, but they have some notorious flooding problems too, and probably would have benefited from a freeboard. I don't know, not having studied it. So I really have to commend engineering staff. Josh understands this stuff. A lot of it's really technical. We're not going to get it. I'm not going to get it. I'm capable of understanding, but I'm not going to go there because I'd have to spend weeks on it. He's done a great job. He's doing exactly what we have to, and that is to bring our ordinance up to date with FEMA requirements so that people don't, that our community doesn't see the cost. We have to be reminded that when we have a flood, it's not just costly to the property owner, it's costly to the entire community, right? But when there's flood damage, your safety services are involved. It's very disruptive, and it's disruptive not just to the present owners, but future generations may pay the cost of our mistakes. So we have two things. Do we have to update this ordinance, and then sort of I see the freeboarding as a separate question. I would be in favor of keeping it. I did send, in case anybody missed it, I made some comments on one of the drafts. I'm not sure if it was the latest one, and sent that around to everyone, but I'm not sure we care about all that stuff. I just did that to try to be helpful to staff to make some comments and maybe while we go through this, if the law department wanted to catch a few housekeeping things in case they want to, and I don't really care at this point if they do or not. I just wanted to, since I was reading the ordinance, that I think I'm looking at 28 pages here, that I might as well make the comments while I was at it.
Well, let me state this, Mr. Zoloff. I'm certain that Mr. Snyder and our law director would want to make any corrections necessary to just correct any Scrivener's errors. I just saw that you sent that a short while ago, did not have a chance to digest it, so I don't know what Scrivener type errors you might have pointed out, but thank you for doing it.
I don't recommend studying it. Just in case you wanted to, and I really, I'm inclined to leave it to the judgment of the law department and the staff to make sure, provided they're following the intent of our recommendations and our vote, I'm fine with it.
Let me ask this so I understand the status of this particular item. It's under old business, and I'm not certain why it's under old business. I don't recall.
It was
having voted
presented
on this.
two months ago, I think, Mr. Murray.
Okay.
I think it was 2 months ago that it came up, and then I think we tabled it. Someone correct me if
We
I'm wrong.
tabled it? Okay.
It came to us. It was tabled last month, and
That's what that was the procedural history I did not recall. Thank you. So it was tabled.
I could
so
be
if
wrong.
we are to
My
take
memory is worse than yours.
Okay, I'm not going to go there. So so in order to properly discuss this and debate it, we should have a motion to pick this up from the table.
I'll make
So
that
moved.
motion, Mr. Chairman. Pete
Second.
McGorry.
Thank you. There was a second? Who was the second?
It was Jade.
Oh, Jade, okay, all right, very good, thank you. Then a motion and second. Discussion on the proposed legislation. I
Mr.
guess
Chairman,
I will
Pete
say,
McGorry.
go ahead.
Is this on the motion to take it off the table or on the legislation itself?
It's a motion to take it off the table.
Yes, you're right, we do need a vote on that.
I thought
Okay,
that's what you moved. I thought that was a motion.
okay.
I can't remember that piece of parliamentary procedure. It may be that if you have a first and a second, it's off the table, but I don't remember. Ms. Brony, would you call the roll on the motion to lift the legislation from the table, please?
Mr. Murray,
Yes.
Mr. McGorry,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff,
Yes.
Mr. Jackson,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Ms. Castillo,
Yes.
That legislation is then taken from the table, and now we can properly debate it. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, I would like to comment then on the legislation. And I've followed closely Mr. Zuloff's assessment, and I can't dispute that. And also, he referenced the explanation of the freeboard requirement, and I can't dispute that. There's many unknowns, and with climate change, we're facing new unknowns. But to play devil's advocate, we do live on a very flat piece of land in the Sandusky area, and we have a lot of waterways, watersheds, and we have the lake, and waterfront property is in demand and people want to build on it. Now, we can leave that freeboard requirement and make that building more difficult, or we can allow the freeboard requirement to be canceled and make that building easier. Who knows what sort of flood issues we're going to have coming forward, and that 2 feet is arbitrary. If you leave it in and the flood hits 2.5 feet, we're still going to have a flooded area, but in the meantime we will have had development and property value increase and taxes because of that value increase. So I mean, you can look at both sides of it, and I don't know what the right answer is. FEMA said they didn't put the 2 feet in. Apparently we did. The question is, do we take it in or leave it in or take it out? And I'm inclined to take it out, personally.
Thank you, Mr. McGorry. Other comments?
I would agree with Mr. McGorry that I think that
staff is on target on this and that it is probably a good move. I kind of more for my own education than anything. I was curious. So in reading, we participate in the federal, I think it's the NFIP insurance program. I'm just wondering what kind of cost that is to the city, and does waiving this freeboard have anything to do with that cost?
Mr. Snyder, are you able to address Mr. Whelan's question?
Sure. Yes, it does not have anything to do with costs for the city. In fact, I believe my understanding is that with Freeboard, there may be discounts off of your flood insurance, but we are members of National Flood Insurance Program. By removing Freeboard does not risk us of getting kicked out or being disqualified from the National Flood Insurance Program. What National Flood Insurance Program means and says is that
Sean
the city
Sprouse.
Is now
the city
exiting.
says that the city of Sandusky regulates the floodplain. We administer what goes on there, and that when one goes for insurance, they're going to get the same uniform price from agent A to B to agent C. Those are set numbers because we are a member.
Okay, thank you for that explanation.
Thank you.
Mr. Murray, I'd like to make another observation. Pete McGorry. If we were to remove the freeboard requirement, I don't see any reason that such a removal would preclude an individual builder from meeting a 2-foot freeboard or higher. So it's not like we're mandating that you can't increase the height of your property or build in a certain way.
Joining.
We're just allowing people to do it with federal floodplain levels, not our own.
Yeah, I think that's right. And my own view on this is that I initially was opposed to removing the freeboard requirement, but after considering the arguments and the facts, particularly the facts that we've rather consistently granted a variance or waiver to that requirement, it actually becomes a little bit questionable as to whether it's even enforceable at this point, since we consistently don't enforce it. But my other thought on that is that, there's a role for paternalism in government. There's also a role for the private sector to play to look out for itself. And a significant construction project is going to be financed, and a bank is going to require that either be reinforced to the point that it's not going to be, or constructed with materials such that it's not going to be affected by a flood or significantly impacted by a flood, or they're going to require that it be built up. And so given all of that, I thought it was appropriate to take out the freeboard. And to Mr. Zulof's point, I'm inclined to accept the considerable education and wisdom of staff in bringing these technical recommendations to us, and appreciate that effort. Other comments on the legislation?
This is Josh again with engineers. The only thing I would add is that with the new mapping and the new zones that are in the new ordinance, specifically the AO zone and the Z zones, there is consideration not in any of the previous mapping for wave action and for additional height above what was formerly termed base flood elevation. So in essence, the new mapping straight from FEMA does have a de facto freeboard in parts of the city built in. So just thought I would add that in, maybe some helpful reinforcement or just a point of interest.
Okay, thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Jackson.
Yes. Usually when they change a law or ordinance, it's to benefit someone. Exactly, what's the primary reason for changing this, and who benefits from it?
Mr. Jackson, I would say that based upon Mr. Snyder's earlier presentation and the materials, that it's primarily being driven by FEMA itself, which is proposing technical changes. I can't answer what motivated FEMA to make those changes. The question as to whether or not we retain the freeboard requirement, I don't know that it is beneficial or detrimental to anyone in particular, except for the fact that every time it's come before the city, we've waived the requirement, all but one, I think, maybe something like that. And so, you know, the question becomes, if we're going to have a law that we're not going to enforce, why do we have a law?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Miller.
Yes, a couple observations, and not that I'm terribly well versed in freeboard, and I've only lived in Sandusky going on 40 years now. It's not like I'm a lifer. Maybe in answer to Mr. Jackson's question, looking at who applied for the waivers might give you some indication of for whose benefit the law would change as it relates to freeboard. But the freeboard issue aside, I think that updating the regulation is probably appropriate. There's terminology that really should be brought up to date, the 1% chance versus the 100-year flood and so forth. But I found it interesting in the materials that of the 13 waivers granted, they all related to the chaussee and over there from what I observed. And as someone already made the observation, the market and developers and so forth, they bear some responsibility. I think the homeowners association out on the chaussee has recently undertaken some pretty substantial projects to beef up their wall and all that. So yeah, I'm not trying to be obstructionist in that regard. I do like the idea of us being conservative and watching out for other people's interests, but that's not the reason for the freeboard. As I think Mike mentioned earlier on, there's city services, emergency services, lots of things that can get screwed up that cost the public money in the event of a flood. And I'm thinking of water service and sewer service and emergency services. I'm not sure that that's really the issue, because I don't see those as problems for us in particular. Elsewhere in the county, in Franklin Flats or in Crystal Rock and other places, they have systemic flooding issues that are a large public expense that we don't really have much in Sandusky. Maybe down on First Street with the development there, the way that the roads and the neighborhoods are impacted when the water is high is something to think about. But I guess in summation, if we do not remove the freeboard and we continue as we have in the past, it would be my advice or recommendation that we not simply waive all requirements of height, but that if we waive a foot or two of the freeboard, that we keep the rest of the FEMA requirements intact to protect ourselves. What I heard Josh saying last time is that when it's waived, there are no standards anymore, and whoever can do whatever for that waived property. That seems to be an imprudent approach. So if we do as we have in the past and continue to have waivers, that we should be more precise and apply the waiver to only a certain amount of footage and not waive all the requirements, because we do want to protect our insurability of those properties. And I think we do want to protect the public interest, and we can let developers do what's in their best interest, or property owners do what's in their best interest. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. There are others who have not spoken yet who wish to comment or ask questions.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I just actually have a question. This is Jade Castillo. If you guys can see me, I don't know. We can't really see anybody but you, Dennis.
Yeah.
I live on 2nd Street, and the flooding on 1st Street is really, really awful. So I wondered, because I'm fairly new to all this, what would happen with those areas that are prone to flooding if the freeboard requirement was removed? Would that be impacted at all? Would things remain the same? Would it get worse? What about those areas that already see flooding just on the regular with the freeboard?
Castillo, it is my understanding, and I'd ask staff to jump in if I'm incorrect, but it doesn't impact any existing structures. This would apply to either additions or new construction.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Mr. Zulal. You're on mute, Mike.
Thank you.
Mike.
Okay. Yeah, I'm back. All right, so I'm going to make the case that the argument about freeboard is really about how safe you want to be. Are you satisfied with 1% chance every year, or would you like the Russian roulette to have a few more chambers in it, right? Is it arbitrary? Well, 100-year flood is arbitrary. 35-mile-an-hour speed limit is arbitrary. A freeboard makes it more conservative and safer. So the argument that we have approved 13 variances out of 13 and the 14th was dropped. The trouble with that argument is that doesn't mean we're not enforcing it, because when people apply, they have a reasonable expectation that it'll be approved. And I'm sure that lots of builders, lots of developments have just gone ahead and met the requirement because it wasn't burdensome. So you could also argue that the fact that we rather, without too much friction, approved it means that it's not burdensome, because when it's appropriate, presumably it's been appropriate in each case, when it's appropriate, without too much friction, the variance has been granted, right? So at the end of the day, all the arguments for removing it at the end of the day fall away, except for the one that says, well, we don't really need to be that safe, okay? And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying, you know, it's a change in policy. We chose to be safer before. It's being proposed to take it away. We don't really know where it originated. I'm pretty sure it just originated from staff based on inquiries and complaints from residents and developers who would be inconvenienced by it. If you ask developers what they think, if you really scratch the surface, what you'd hear was, we don't need any regulation at all. We'll decide, right? So even that doesn't hold water. At the end of the day, it's how safe do you want to be, okay? And I'm not going to lose any sleep if we don't keep the freeboard, but I want us to make sure that we're considering this soundly and not with specious arguments. That's all. And to Mr. Miller's point, yes, even if we keep whether we keep the freeboard or not, it's sort of a separate question. Whether when we grant a variance, whether we have a freeboard or not, what should that variance say? You would hope that the variance would be very specific. I have actually, but it hasn't been. Okay, so what I added in my annotation, my notes to the legislation, is a few words that basically says there's a requirement that if you apply for a variance, you have to explain the reason. Well, or explain why you're doing it. It also says you have to explain what the deviation is going to be. I just basically add a sentence that says you got to say how much of a deviation from the standard it's going to be. Are you asking for, a foot or 2 feet? That you can't just ask for a variance without specifying what the variance is going to be, right? So I think it's really important we do that either way. So it's kind of a separate issue.
May I ask, I assume it is BZA that approves the variance. Am I right or wrong?
That's correct. BZA doesn't, BZA has 2 roles. They're the appeals body. Okay, in other words, if the engineering staff says you can't do that, and they don't agree with the ruling, then they go to BZA. And if BZA agrees, if they don't agree with the BZA, then it goes to court. Okay. The other thing BZA does is gets to rule on granting of variances, right? So there's two different roles, right? So and we're talking about the variances here. If someone says, hey, I want you to let me build this thing, a foot lower, and I don't want to meet the floodproofing, and they can grant a variance, and then, and I might be missing some details here, but so at the end of the day, the question is, do we want to be more conservative and safer or not? All the rest of it, I think, falls. All those other arguments fall away. And
let me just ask one question of staff. Can anyone answer the question as to whether or not the variances are granted with conditions? That is, you can be, at the floodplain, but you can't be lower than it, or is it just, it's not going to apply to you, you can do whatever you want? And if nobody knows the answer to that question, then we might have to follow up. Jonathan or Josh? Josh, do you know?
Yeah, this is Josh. I've been on the hearings for the last year and a half, and there's not been any conditions set forth by that body contingent on approval or as a condition of the approval. No. Now, prior to that, I wasn't on staff, so I can't speak to previous to basically a year and a half.
Okay, thank you. Well,
so you see the problem.
There's been a pretty good. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, I see the problem, and I'm not sure that that's something that we can address. Please.
Yeah. Right. So the argument would go, well, the board can place limits and conditions. The trouble is that the system isn't working because it's not happening. Either they're not suggested by the staff, or the applicant doesn't want to place for whatever reason. So I think it's fairly obvious that there needs to be some limitation. I didn't even suggest a limitation. I suggested that all applications, if it asked for a deviation from the elevation standard, that they ask for a specific amount, and also language that says that the BZA should either grant that or something in between, a lesser deviation, right? I didn't even get into what the limit should be because I don't know, and I think I'd rather have the staff suggest how far we should be able to go on variances, or maybe some sort of language that requires that the staff make sure that whatever's proposed or not, some requirement that the application for a variance be specific on precisely what variances they're looking for. And if it was explicit that we want,
I think you make a good point, and the staff and the relevant staff is on the call, so I think that's an excellent point. Ms. Castillo has to be recognized, I believe. Ms. Castillo, are you still there?
I'm here, but I think I see David Miller's hand. I haven't raised my hand right.
Oh, I thought you did. Mr. Miller, I'm sorry.
Yes, I raised my hand, but I'm still playing with the technology, so I didn't know if it'd really work. It seemed less rude than interjecting and through you, Mr. Chairman. I have another observation and kind of in following up with Mike's comments about just how safe do we want to be. I think that, from my understanding, this discussion about revising the ordinance is more than just the question of freeboard. There's other language and updates involved. Maybe the freeboard is the most substantial thing, but the change in terminology from 100-year flood to 1% chance, I think, is potentially significant and something I'd like to muse just a moment about. My understanding, could be completely wrong, is the reason to update the terminology from 100-year flood is because we are having too damn many 100-year floods. We were having 100-year floods, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 every decade in recent years. And so it just seemed kind of stupid and not intuitive to say, oh yeah, we're talking about a 100-year flood, because we've had 14 of them in the last 10 years or something like that. So, okay, we'll change it to a 1% chance. Doesn't really change the likelihood of how much water you're going to get. It just says, oh, well, yeah, 1% chance this year, 1% chance next year. We got a random walk of dice rolls and we're getting all these 1% chances. It doesn't seem quite as stupid as, oh, it's only supposed to happen once in 100 years, but it happens all the time. All right, that's my observation, and I want to cue that up to Mike's comment about just how safe do we want to be. That's it.
Okay, thank you. It seems to me, commissioners, that I can frame this a little bit. I don't think there's a lot of objection to the underlying legislation. The debate is going to come down to a motion to amend the legislation to remove the freeboard. It's in the current legislation. So if we're going to make a decision on whether to retain the freeboard element, I think it has to be by way of a motion to add that back in. Mr. Zula, you're on mute. Mike, you're on mute. Mike, you're still on mute. Mike, we want to hear what you heard, and you're on mute.
Mr. Chair, I got a quick one. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, Mike found it.
Okay, so
yeah, we got him now.
I'm disagreeing. This might be, my understanding, this is a working document. What we have to do is get enough discussion to get to a specific final proposal. We may need more than one. We may need to look at, do we want to do the updates that are needed? One. Number two, do we want to rescind the freeboarding? And then maybe three, do we want to place some limits on variances? So we really have three. I would distill it to three questions, right? And
the chair will entertain a motion to amend the legislation.
We could discuss.
The chair will entertain a motion to amend the legislation.
Right. We could discuss and vote on three different questions, and then that could be congealed into a single piece of legislation that would go to City Commission, I suppose.
Well, there's a process.
Question, if I may, one more thing that I don't want to leave out here. I was promised by staff to confirm that we really needed to do this year, because I talked to another jurisdiction who was under the impression that these changes really weren't necessary for next year. So if it takes the pressure off of it, and if we can get some clarity on when this must be done to satisfy FEMA, it may give us all the time in the world to figure out what to do here. I don't know.
Okay.
Mr. Holliday, do you remember?
Wait a minute, hold
we-
on, Mr. Zuloff. I want to add some structure to this discussion.
Okay.
And we're wandering all over the place, and we're not following Robert's rules or anything close to it.
Mr. Chair, may I quickly?
Well, I want to get Mr. Zuloff's question answered first. Mr. Snyder, are you able to tell us whether there's a requirement that this legislation needs to be passed this year?
Our understanding is we will the newest version of mapping for Sandusky in 2021. We do not have a hard and fast date,
Okay.
but I believe to come the next couple of months.
You broke up there a little bit, Josh.
Yeah, sorry about that. My understanding is our mapping is close to being finalized from FEMA, and that would mean it would become effective in the next couple months. There was a little bit of I don't want to say dispute, but there were some points of contention with some homeowners in the floodplain, and FEMA addressed those, and it does not affect the preliminary mapping nor any of the ordinance terminologies in that ordinance that you have before you.
All right, thank you. I want to return to Mr. Whalen, who had something he wanted to add.
Yeah, just quickly, to me, this kind of, it was asked earlier, who benefits? To me, I see this as private development, just in general benefiting, because we as government entity aren't necessarily deciding the level of risk that they're comfortable with. They're putting their money into this from whether it comes from a bank or the person doing the project themselves. And as far as I see it, really they're facing the brunt of the risk in this as well. So, sure, as Mr. Zuloff and Mr. Miller have said, there is indirect risk that we face, you know, if we are, if we need to provide services there, but I don't see that as likely what's happening. So I don't think there's a motion yet to approve as recommended. I would make such a motion and invite anybody who could convince me that there is significant community risk being faced here to do that.
Mr. Chairman, Glory, I'll
second
that. I'll second that motion.
Okay. Thank you. There's a motion and second. Mr. Zuloff, with all due respect, the way we have to proceed is we have to decide changes to the legislation based upon proposed amendments. So
okay,
we're going.
But what?
Yeah.
What are we talking about specifically? What's in the packet and nothing else? Because you know, I thought we even had agreement from the staff that it still needed work.
Well, okay. There are a couple of parliamentary options here. We can make a motion to amend the legislation to add or subtract. We can also make a motion to table it until such time as we can have additional information or changes brought to us. And I see that the law director has arrived at my rescue to make sure that I'm doing this right and to see if there are other options that we can entertain. Mr. High.
Yes, Commissioner Murray, you're correct that if the Planning Commission desires to actually amend the language of the ordinance as proposed and make that recommendation to City Commission, basically changing your recommendation to City Commission, it would be a motion to amend, and it would be contained to what is actually in the current proposal in front of you. So the draft as presented to the Planning Commission is in front of you. If you would like to make a motion to amend a specific section, to add however you want to phrase that, that is a potential option. You're correct. If you would like, if it is Planning Commission's desire for this to be redrafted with your direction by staff, I would recommend maybe a motion to postpone provide some direction, and then staff can bring it back with those changes added, and then Planning Commission could take it up as a motion to make a recommendation to City Commission again. Those are probably their two best options. Both are obviously acceptable from my perspective.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Zuloff.
I think I don't know if a straw vote would be a waste of time or useful or not. I'm not quite sure where we are. If we don't have the votes to keep the freeboarding, I'll move on and we can address the other question about limits on variances. But I'm counting and I'm not sure where we are. Now, but we have a motion, and I'm not sure what the motion was. We're discussing a motion right now. I'm not sure what the motion is.
The motion is to recommend the legislation to the City Commission.
What legislation?
Legislation that's in the packet until such time as it's amended.
Thank you. Just so that's clear. But I'm again pointing out with the law director present now that it was our understanding that, I think it may even be, I don't know if it's in the minutes or not, it's probably in the tapes, that legislation, I think it was acknowledged it needed some work. So that's the way I understood it. It was acknowledged at a prior meeting that, for example, it only changed 100-year floodplain in one place. It still exists in the proposed legislation, and what should have happened is that it should be changed to the 100-year floodplain should be removed everywhere, and where needed, substituted what the 1% annual chance be substituted, for example. So I can't vote for it as it is now. I couldn't vote for it in principle, and I also would like to either propose amending the motion or voting it down and making a new motion, because I think we really should include something about limitations on variances. I think it's clear that the staff seems to acknowledge, and we seem to understand that we need some limitations on the variances, and that's not in the draft of the legislation right now.
Well, you can add it by motion.
Right.
So I mean,
we have a motion to approve. So no, I can't. Oh yes, you're right. I can make a motion to amend the motion to approve.
You can make a motion to amend the legislation to add that we ask staff.
No, I can't.
Come back.
I can only. We've already had a motion on the table.
May I interject really quickly, just to clarify this? If a commission member wishes to make an amendment to the legislation that is currently in front of you, which the motion is to recommend the legislation as currently in front. If you would like to amend that legislation, Commissioner Murray is correct. Make a motion to amend the legislation to include something, vote on that motion. That amendment would be included to the legislation that would then be in the kind of superseding motion to make the recommendation to City Commission. So you're moving to amend on the current table motion to include specific additions or amendments to the legislation.
Thank you. So to clarify, as a point of order, we have a motion on the table. So if I want to pass the draft, so if we want to amend that, we need a motion to amend the motion. Do we not?
Yeah, that's what, if you move to amend, that's what you do.
That's what I said. Okay, so.
That's what I said. You want to make, Mike, the chair will entertain a motion to amend.
That's not what you said.
The chair will entertain a motion to amend the legislation that we are going to recommend to the City Commission.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make the motion to amend the motion to include language to make any application for variance specific to what part of the ordinance, what part of the ordinance the variation will address, and to include specific numbers when the request is for the elevation standard.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, David Miller, I'll second. I also have a question of clarification.
Please.
The legislation as recommended, that still includes the freeboard
Yes.
or not? Or
So,
does the
Mr. Zuloff,
recommendation say eliminate the freeboard?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The legislation, that's right. The legislation has removed, the legislation that's in front of us has removed the freeboard requirement. And so we're going to have a second motion to take up the debate on, have a vote on whether or not to add it back in.
Thank you.
Okay. Comments or questions on the motion to amend the legislation to add a limitation on variances? Mr. McGorry.
Mr. Chairman, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but if we were to approve Mr. Zuloff's motion to amend and include language in the amended legislation requiring specific limitations on any variance granted, correct me if I'm wrong, but the hearing body on any application could still issue their own variance. I mean, they can always issue a variance to avoid that requirement. Am I right? I mean, they may not agree that that's appropriate, but they would have that ability.
Of course.
Mr. Heil, can you answer that question? Because it seems to me the answer to Mr. McGorry's question has to be no. That if the city commission puts in legislation that you can grant a variance, but you have to say that it's going to be specific in terms of what is being buried and how far it's going to be buried, that's binding on the BZA.
That's correct. If the ordinance itself is binding on the BZA, and we have to comply with all of, and there are currently regulations it has to comply with when it grants a variance. And if this becomes an additional one, they would have to follow that.
But that would be a condition. In other words, it has to have a limitation included, but it doesn't say what that limitation is. Am I correct in that regard on this motion?
As I understand it, yes.
Okay. So I still don't know exactly where that leaves us. It to me, it's still open-ended. So I'm not trying to be argumentative. I'm just trying to figure out where that leaves us. So.
Well, I think that's a pretty specific expression by the city commission to the BZA if the legislation is adopted, that you have to, there are some limits here. You've got to say how far you're going to go, and you've got to say specifically what is being waived. I think that's strong enough to have some.
But it doesn't put an end point on something. That just says they have to, as part of the variance, specify what the end point is,
yes,
rather than just taking it away. Okay.
That's another way of saying that.
Okay.
Further comments or questions on the motion to amend as proposed by Mr. Zuloff? Ms. Brony, would you call the roll on the motion to amend?
Yes. Mr. McGorry?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Castillo?
Yes.
Oh, and Mr. Murray,
Okay,
sorry.
motion, I thought maybe I hadn't voted. Okay, so yes, so that motion is approved, and that becomes part of the legislation to be recommended to the City Commission. At this point, would someone care to make another motion to amend?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to I would like to amend the original motion to remove the removal of the freeboarding and leave the freeboarding in there. And this will be the straw vote. We'll find out, where we are with it then. So.
There's been a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Jackson, there's a motion and second. Discussion on the question of retaining the freeboard or amending the legislation recommended to the commission to add back the freeboard requirement.
Mr. Chairman, David Miller.
Miller.
Discussion.
Yeah.
I know it was suggested that 2 foot is arbitrary, and when I read the freeboard requirements from other jurisdictions, some that had it, some that didn't, and others that had it who didn't have 2 feet, in a classic split the baby sort of way of looking at it, maybe 1 foot freeboard gets us halfway there. If somebody wants to develop a project, we want them to pretty specifically look at that question. It hasn't been onerous to have freeboard waived, but just as a general safety policy question, by adding a 1 foot freeboard, for example, might take a 1% chance of flooding and make it 0.5% or 0.25%. And hence we're building to a 200-year flood or a 400-year flood. Instead of this 1% chance, we've upped our chance a little bit, and we've met the developer's request to eliminate it halfway. We don't know, as somebody said earlier, how many people didn't request a waiver because they just built to comply with what the requirement was, and that was a good, safe way to do it. I'm not sure why Mr. Waldock is putting his condos so high up on the bayfront north of First Street, but water isn't going to run past those buildings. It'll run back to First Street before it does, and then the city will get to pump it out the way it is for Ms. Castillo's concern about how this would affect existing properties. That's it.
Mr. Miller, would you like me to construe your comments as a motion to amend the motion to amend to change that to a 1 foot freeboard requirement?
I just offered
Mr.
it.
Chairman, point of
Wait,
order.
One a second, I'm trying to clarify
This
what
is the point of order. It takes precedence.
All right, go ahead.
If it's gonna make you mad, I'll just drop it. But I was going to point out that a motion to amend it to 1 foot would still be in order, even if we voted down to 2 foot. If you don't want to get into motion to amend the motion to amend, I'll leave it to the chair.
Okay, Mr. Miller, how shall I construe your comments?
I was not intending to make a motion. I was intending to offer a point of discussion that there are other options. It's not 2 foot or nothing necessarily, that we could enhance our level of safety and meet in the middle with that as sort of a compromise.
All right. Further comments on the motion to amend?
Just so.
Brony, would you?
I'm sorry,
Castillo.
Mr. Chairman, sorry about that. Just so I'm clear, we're voting now on legislation that includes putting the freeboard back along with some new variants requirements or conditions. Is that what I understand?
That's correct. So we've already amended the motion to add the requirement that there be some limitations on variances.
Okay.
And then right now we're considering whether to add back or I guess I should say really retain what is in current city law, which is the freeboard requirement.
Okay. Thank you.
Brony, would you call the question would you call the motion on or call the roll on the motion to amend? I'm sorry.
Yes, Mr. Murray?
Yes.
Mr.
Wait a minute. Hold on a second. No, I meant no.
Okay.
Pardon me.
Mr. McGorry?
No.
Mr. Miller?
No.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Mr. Jackson?
No.
Mr. Whalen?
No.
Ms. Castillo?
No.
All right, commissioners, are there further motions to amend or other motions to consider?
Mr. Chairman. Oh, never mind.
Mr. Chairman, through you, shouldn't take too long. What if we have a motion for a 1-foot freeboard? Just vote it up or down.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Further discussion on the motion to amend to add a 1-foot freeboard requirement. Ms. Barone, would you call the roll on the motion? I'm sorry, Mr. Snyder, do you have something to add?
Mr. Murray, the only item I was going to add about the randomness of any freeboard to be added, with the new mapping that's undoubtedly coming, I assume this year, there is a new zone designated by FEMA. It's an AO zone, probably worth a look. There's already a built-in, like I mentioned before, a de facto freeboard. It's 2 feet above existing grade. So imagine any of the properties in this affected area. Off the top of my head, I know there's a good chunk of the southeastern portion of the chaussee that is in this AO zone. So it's the ground level plus 2 feet. And if we keep any freeboard, it's an additional height above the existing ground. So just keep in mind, like, buildings projecting on these sites, and so that's going to be the basis for people's ire of this new mapping. And again, one of the challenges of us regulating it, but you know, we'll do what we're given ordinance for. So I just wanted you all to know that and be aware of again some of the new mapping changes that we're going to have to ultimately regulate.
Mr. Snyder, I would ask you to, I want to clarify. Mr. Snyder, could you go over that math with us again? Because I'm not really quite sure what you just said.
There's a section of the southeastern portion of the chaussee, including residential parcels, that is in a newly designated AO zone. And because of wave action, as I previously mentioned, that wave action is incorporated into the new maps, and it requires buildings be built elevated above the existing ground surrounding the development in that AO zoned area 2 feet. And that's FEMA's base flood level in that AO zone as soon as that map becomes effective. So any additional freeboard, we, the city, are requiring the developer to build X feet higher than the ground level in that zone.
I got it. Thank you for clarifying that. Mr. Zuloff.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry this didn't go quicker. I know that I understand the point that our engineer, Mr. Snyder's making, but it was arguably a deficiency because the old standard didn't account for wave or wind setup and certain other features. We don't know yet. We don't have those new maps. We don't really know where they're going to be. It's better to err on the side of caution. This is not an irreversible decision. It would be no big deal if we find out that we're really being burdened by the new arrangement, the new maps. We can always go back to zero later. So if we err on the side of restrictiveness, the variances are available. There's little resistance to them when they're sought. But if we err on the side of permissiveness, you really can't go back once you let something happen in a bad place. There's no going back, right? So at the end of the day, being conservative is not burdensome. It's not irreversible in more ways than one. We can change the legislation, but being too permissive is irreversible. That's my point.
Thank you. Additional points or questions on the motion to amend to add back the 1 foot freeboard requirement? Ms. Brony, would you call the roll on the motion? I'm sorry, Mr. Miller?
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a quick question? If I understood the engineer correctly, it's not that you have to raise the elevation of the land. You don't have to infill. You just have to design your house to have an additional foot of up on stilts or strong construction that isn't going to flood to raise the height of the house itself an additional foot with this proposed 1 foot freeboard in this area that we have not really understood yet. We do not know exactly what area will be affected by the requirement that it be the house 2 foot above the existing ground level. Did I understand that correctly?
Mr. Snyder, can you address that question?
Sure. Yeah, and I can provide you the maps for details of the area, but there are entire residential parcels included within. Off the top of my head, I don't know addresses, but yeah, that is indeed the case. That if in those zones, if someone wants to build a new structure, their lowest finished floor elevation must be 2 feet above the grade of the land surrounding where that structure house is getting built.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. McGorry.
And if we add another foot, then that's 3 feet above. So I mean, again, I think everybody understand that, but if they don't, I wanted to make it clear. So I personally would vote against that amendment and live with what FEMA does.
Additional questions or comments?
Mr. President, this is Josh again, and I will only respond to that last comment that is correct. That would be 3 feet, and I think getting the visual on that exemplifies the fact that FEMA has incorporated a safety factor into the elevations that they set and give us as locals to administer. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Ms. Brony, would you call the roll on the motion to amend?
Yes. Mr. Murray?
No.
Mr. McGorry?
No.
Mr. Miller?
No.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Mr. Jackson?
No.
Mr. Whalen?
No.
Ms. Castillo?
No.
That motion is defeated and does not become part of the legislation to recommend to the City Commission. Commissioners, there's been a lot of discussion tonight. I am not clear. Mr. Snyder, if you wish to speak, I'd be happy to entertain your thoughts in just a moment. But I thought I saw your hand raised there.
Mr. Chairman, I raised my hand. This is Jade Castillo.
Oh, well, it came up in front of Josh's name. Okay, all right. Go ahead, Ms. Castillo.
This might be a little late to ask, but just so I understand correctly, that extra 3 feet that we just discussed, that's only applicable to certain areas, right? Because he mentioned.
I understood.
Or is that it?
Mr. Snyder, that's yes.
Okay.
Mr. Snyder, can you confirm that?
Yeah, that is correct. The 3 foot, and again, that may be like the most visual, impactful scenario for the new zones that will be applied. with the new mapping. But yeah, that 3 feet appears to be isolated to that portion of southern portion of the chaussee.
Okay, and so then the other areas would be at a 0. Is that correct, or? I'm sorry,
No.
for my knowledge, I don't know much about floodplains and all that, so I'm just trying to make sure I understand correctly what's going on.
So the base flood elevation is a height, not relative to the ground necessarily, except for in that AO zone area. So there's a height that needs to be built to, but the grade of the land where someone's building a house is not a reference to what they need to build necessarily. So there's really not an answer to that question other than no, you really can't go by the grade of the land other than in that specific newly designated zone.
And it's 2
And
feet.
Mr.
not
Snyder,
3
that
feet,
was
by the
that
way.
was 2 feet, a 2 feet FEMA requirement, not 3, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, 2 feet. We were going to add a foot, so it would have made it 3. That's what I was mistaken. I apologize for that.
Right.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Zuloff, did you have a comment, sir?
I was just going to point out it's 2 feet, not 3.
Okay. So here's where we are. It seems to me as though, barring additional motions to amend, I've heard some expression about whether or not this should be left with staff a little bit longer to perhaps make some other changes of a technical nature. I'm not sure what the commission's will is in that regard, or if the commission is prepared to recommend the legislation tonight. Can I get some direction on that?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. The motion is made and seconded. We have to vote on it. We vote no. We can't really bring it up again in the same form. And if we vote yes, it's passed. So that ship has sailed as far as this. We kind of closed the door on further work from the staff when we made and seconded the motion.
I don't think that's a point of order, Mr. Zuloff. What I was asking for was whether there was someone on the commission that wanted to either put it back on the table or to take some other steps so that staff could have additional time to work on the proposed legislation.
And may I make a recommendation?
Please.
Chair, if you would like staff to take additional look at this, I would recommend moving to postpone until the next meeting, which makes it really clear that you're going to take it up on the next agenda so we don't have that weird old business thing that we did earlier today. That would probably be my recommendation.
Mr. Chairman, McGorry, I'll move to postpone and ask staff to take a further look at this just to clean it up in final form.
Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, I'll second. Jade Castillo.
Mr. Heil, I haven't seen this one before. I'm going to guess this is a non-debatable motion.
It is. I would recommend that maybe in just general discussion that commissioners maybe want to pass along guidance separate so that staff knows exactly what they would like them to take a look at. I know there was some in the meetings, but yes, this is not debatable.
Okay, very good. Ms. Browning, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Murray,
Yes.
Mr. McGorry,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff,
Yes.
Mr. Jackson,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Ms. Castillo.
Yes.
Okay, that is postponed. Mr. Heil was suggesting that this would be an appropriate time, I believe, to pass along to staff any particular suggestions that you have to make tonight, or to reach out to staff perhaps following the meeting to make individual recommendations. Are there specific recommendations that any of the commission members would like to make to staff tonight.
Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Miller.
From my perspective, when a revised final draft is available to include what we amended tonight about waivers and so forth, it would be very helpful to me to get notification. I'd be glad to swing by the city hall and pick up a hard copy. That would be helpful to me.
Okay, thank you.
I'll second that request. McGorry.
Additional suggestions for staff? Okay. All right. I think we need to move on to the next item then. We had a fulsome debate tonight, and I appreciate everyone's participation in that and the exposition of the different viewpoints. My own hangriness at the moment notwithstanding, I think a lot of you know Mr. Zoloff and I are actually friends, but we had a good debate, and but we've settled a couple of things tonight, hopefully too. Okay, who is presenting the Sandusky Properties LLC proposal? Is that you, Mr. Horstman?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and we do have the applicant on the call as well. We can complement my initial introduction to the application with more specifics on their proposal. This is a site plan approval for 534 Columbus Avenue. It's at the corner of East Madison Street and Columbus. It's an existing single-story dental office with a parking lot directly to the south. It's a zoned local business zoning district. The proposal is coming to the Planning Commission today because of a proposed expansion and renovation. It would add square footage on the second floor. Just for some background context too, in regard to the parking requirements, as you can see here, this commission did approve a shared use agreement with the Diocese of Toledo for the lot across the street to satisfy the minimum parking requirements for a dental office, as well as the applicant in changing the parking lot for this renovation will be adding some parking blocks to differentiate the parking spaces with the sidewalk that's along Columbus Avenue. And I included the elevations in the packet as well to get a look at it. That's all I have from staff's report, and we'll defer to the applicant for any additional information about the project.
How you doing? Leon Sampat with LS Architects. So yeah, we are proposing to basically redo the building that Dr. Aruda is currently occupying at Sandusky Orthodontics. We are looking at adding a mezzanine level for additional staff areas. I do have a rendering here. I wasn't sure if this was in the packet or not, but that's essentially what we're looking at doing for the structure. So the brick area will be kind of the existing building height, and then the new stone structures are basically rescaling the existing and adding some height to it. I don't know if anybody has any additional questions on the project.
Commissioners, questions about the proposal? All right. Hearing no questions.
I have one question. I don't know if the lot looks big enough to me to require landscaping. Is that not a requirement here?
Mr. Horstman, can you address that question?
I'm sorry, that was breaking up.
Yeah, Mr. Zoloff was asking whether the lot is large enough to require landscaping, I believe.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I think from staff's perspective, we were primarily concerned about adding a separation to making sure that the parking blocks were there so that to prevent cars from encroaching potentially onto the sidewalk, which the applicant did say would be part of the presentation. But with the existing parking lot, as is in the current configuration, staff did not have any specific recommendations in terms of adding additional landscaping because of the size and the current situation.
But the question was, would the standard call for landscaping, or does this meet? Is this fully compliant with our legislation regarding landscape?
That's to my knowledge, I believe with this type of situation, I believe the commission can. I believe it says that the commission can ask for or mandate additional landscape, but from my understanding, it was be compliant with the regulations.
So if I understand you correctly, Mr. Horstman, you believe the current project or the current structure is compliant, but that the Planning Commission has the authority in connection with the consideration of a proposed site plan to require landscaping.
Yes.
So if you scroll back to our site plan, we're actually proposing a little bit of landscaping beds in front of the building to soften the building. I don't have to go up a couple of that right there. So we're at the east lot. The west lot is our shared parking agreement. We have 18 spots over there. So we are looking at trying to soften up the building a little bit with some landscaping, if that helps.
I see that now. I did not recognize that when I looked at the drawing originally. So thank you for pointing that out. So, commissioners, I think what would be appropriate at this point is to ask for a motion to approve the site plan.
Mr. Chairman, Pete McGorry, also move.
And a motion.
Mr. Chairman, David Miller, second.
A discussion on the motion. If not, Ms. Barone, would you call the roll on the motion, please?
Mr. Murray?
Yes.
Mr. McGorry?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Castillo?
Yes.
The motion is approved.
Thank you.
Mr. Sprouse, good luck to you and your client.
Thank you.
Commissioners, we have now, as I understand it, some public comments that we have received that are to be read into the minutes. Ms. Brony, is that your understanding of what we are about to do?
I believe we're on the third application right now for Mr. Sprouse.
Oh, I apologize. Mr. Horstman, would you have a presentation to make in connection with this proposal?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I will just give some general context about this. This is a substitution of non-conforming use. What this does is it allows for the Planning Commission to take a previously not legally non-conforming or a current non-conforming use and substitute it with a different non-conforming use or one that is less restrictive. This is a property on Venice Road that has served as a motel in a general manufacturing district. You can see the site is outlined in red, surrounded on both sides by single-family residential parcels. The proposal from the applicant is to turn the motel into a 7-unit multifamily dwelling on the basis of a multifamily use being less restricted than, I'm sorry, more restricted, less intensive use than a transient motel. If approved, also the structure would need to be complied with building and zoning code requirements for multifamily dwellings. Mr. Sprouse is on the line as well, who can provide additional detail about the application and plan.
You were muted, Mr. Murray.
Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Sprouse. Is there anything you'd like to add, please?
No, that sums it up. This particular structure is already and must have originally been built as a multi-family structure that has separate kitchens, bedrooms, bathrooms. It's larger than what you would call a motel room. So at this point, there's no future expansion or proposed development. It's primarily cosmetic upgrades and aesthetic type repairs that we would be making and converting it into a normal apartment rental situation.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioners,
Chairman.
Mr. Miller, Mr. McGorry.
Based on what I've heard and seen so far, I would go ahead and move forward to make a motion to approve the application as submitted in order to move forward to discussion.
Thank you, sir. The motion, is there a second? Mr. Jackson.
Yeah, I have a question because I was a little bit confused about when he was describing what's going to happen here. Is he going to turn this into apartments, or is there construction to make another area for 7 units?
No, this is an.
Go ahead.
This is an existing structure. All we are doing really is requesting a change in the length of tenancy. There's no new construction or any expansion going on at this time. It's strictly cosmetic and the length of tenancy.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Zuloff, did someone make a second? I can't.
There was no second. I hope we just call it dying for lack of a second, because I still have questions about the application without it getting to the discussion of the merits of it.
Well, so, we don't get to that. This is a second.
Mr. Chairman, David Miller, I intended to second. I'm not sure what happened to my second.
I think I didn't hear you then. Okay, then I'll recognize you, Mr. Zuloff.
All right. Do we have a second or not?
There's a second, yes.
Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you. So my question is, first of all, could I ask that, I'll do it too, everybody turn down your volume to the lowest level you can use, because it'll reduce the feedback. And maybe even mute your mic when you're not talking. So we're talking about 7 units. Is that the number of units already there for the staff? What is the square footage of, what's the minimum square footage that we're talking about per unit? All I need to know is what's the square footage of the smallest unit?
I believe we're in the neighborhood of 300 to 400. I haven't measured them specifically, but
for the staff, what is the minimum acceptable square footage for a residential unit in the city of Sandusky?
Mr. Horstman, Mr. Holliday, do you know the answer to that question?
Give me one moment, Mr. Chairman, I have it.
I believe, Mr. Chairman, I believe it's 450 square feet. So we're not just talking about the change in the use. Even if we allow this, we still have a problem with meeting the minimum requirements for a residential unit. So what we're doing is we're going from what was maybe a motel mini suite or a rather large, generous hotel room and going to a substandard, too small residential unit that we wouldn't allow anywhere else.
Mr. Chairman, it's for clarification, it's 400 square feet. It is in a
The minimum
multifamily.
is 400. Is that the answer?
400.
Not 450.
Yeah, 450 is for a two-family dwelling. For multifamily, it's 400 for the unit.
Thank you. That helps. So I think we need to clarify how far we are from not meeting the standard that we hold everybody else to for what's not substandard housing.
Let me ask Mr. Horstman or perhaps Mr. Heil, is that a question for this body or is that a question for the building department when an occupancy permit is granted or applied for?
I hope the chair isn't talking about ruling it out of order because it's not relevant, because it is, because we've got to deliberate this based on all the issues. It is certainly relevant, and
I haven't ruled anything out of order, but I have asked a question of the law director. So you're out of order, and let Mr. Heil answer the question.
Regarding whether or not it like a specific dwelling unit complies with I would say it's a question for the permit for occupancy for the specific units. Tonight, I think the question is whether or not the Planning Commission wants to approve the non-conforming use. I don't know if Mr. Horstman has anything to add.
So am I to understand that what we're saying is that we cannot consider the fact that this would result in substandard permanent residential units?
I answered that question once already. The answer is you may consider that. We may consider that, of course.
Thank you. I wasn't clear on that.
I would like to add, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Whalen.
This is Mr. Sprouse.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Under the current situation, we have the ability to rent for up to 30 days. So regardless of what size units these are, today we have the ability to rent them on a month-to-month basis. What we are requesting here is for us to be transparent and offer 12-month leases rather than 30-day leases. So, we're just trying to comply with zoning and not get into anything other than the length of occupancy.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, you had your hand up. You're on mute at the moment, Jim. Jim, you're on mute. Hey, Jim, you're on mute. Jim Jackson, you're on mute. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Would it be fair for them to do all this remodeling and then find out after they've done it that they don't meet the requirements for an extended stay?
Mr. Whalen.
Yeah, I've debated putting my hand down, but I feel like we kind of still need some clarification on your question because I have the same one. It's my assumption that when these are, before they actually rent them, they will need to go through building for occupancy permits, which they are now hearing for certain that their units will need to be 400 square feet to comply with. Is that correct or not?
That is the same that is what I understand.
Well, I guess my question, this is Mr. Sprouse again. My question is why we would need to go through an occupancy permit if there's no material or substantial construction being done. It's all cosmetic. And what we're talking about is the length of occupancy, because we could do nothing tonight and this can get voted down and we can just do 30-day leases. So, and not have to go through the rigmarole of occupancy permits. We're not changing the structure. We're just changing the length of stay.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Heil, can you answer the question first as to whether an occupancy permit has to be pulled when there's been a change of ownership or a change of use?
I don't know that they would have to pull a new, I don't know off the top of my head, but if it's necessary for them to comply with any changes in permitting, obviously the 400 feet would be one of the considerations. I don't know off the top of my head, though.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Zuloff. Mr. Zuloff asked to be recognized earlier. Mike, you still there?
Yeah, I'm going to wait.
Okay, Mr. McGorry.
Mr. Chairman, I may be wrong about this, but I think that 30-day requirement is a definition of transient rental. Anything less than 30 days is deemed transient. So that's where you get up to 30 days. Now, what I don't know is, can you keep rolling the same tenant over 30 days, 30 days, 30 days? I guess that would be up to the law department to determine if they're going to enforce. If it turns out to be in actuality long-term rental in a transient rental, I don't want to say variance, but non-conforming use. So, but I don't think it's that you have the authority to rent. Well, you do have the authority to rent up to 30 days because transient is designated anything under 30 days. So that would include up to 30 days.
Correct. Up to, but not in excess of. Yeah.
So now, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Zuloff.
So right now, I don't think the law allows you to repeat 30 days indefinitely. That basically subverts the limit. So that argument just doesn't hold water. So I have no problem with somebody living in too cramped quarters for a month as a temporary situation. But we have to consider, and I'm kind of taking this blind, but because I really, for this to continue to move forward, we would have to approve this, and in my opinion, you would need a variance to allow the smaller units for permanent housing, which I think you can make the case, especially if they're nice enough and they're not, cramped quarters and would not fall in the realm, under the realm of substandard housing. We had this discussion with the downtown. We have a 750 square foot standard for downtown business, right? You can make the case if you got a beautiful water view and marble countertops and it's a studio apartment, get a variance and you're good to go. So I think the owner could apply for a variance. If you're going to apply for a variance, maybe it needs to be, or maybe it's conditional use. I'm not sure which it is. I think it might be a variance, not a conditional use. If you can make the case that this isn't going to be, that you're doing things to mitigate it, so you're not creating substandard housing, I'm okay with that. But we need to consider that this is a possibility. You could wind up with something that we wouldn't normally allow here. That's all I have.
Thank you. Commissioners, additional questions or comments? Or comments from staff or Mr. Sprouse?
Mr. Chairman?
I'm not.
Oh.
Yes.
Ms. Castillo.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just was going to ask, because maybe I missed it. We don't know, is it a fact, is it for certain that not all of the units are at least 400 square feet?
We don't have that information at the moment, I don't believe.
Okay, so then,
I believe 5 of them are and 2 of them are not.
okay. So then if we voted this is more, again, just for my own knowledge. So if we voted to pass this through and it gets all the way to the next steps and things, and then it's found that those units don't meet the requirements, will it be stopped if it is substandard housing, or if we let it go through and say, if it is a problem down the line, it will be stopped where it needs to be stopped? Is that a reliable, I guess, assumption?
I think that's the question Mr. Zuloff is asking, and I think Mr. Zuloff, or perhaps it was someone else, was suggesting that another way to approach that would be to approve the non-conforming use with some limitations.
Mr. Chairman, I was suggesting that it would also require the further step of getting a variance for any units that do not meet the standard, because and I think we could argue that a change of use, that this change should trigger, that inspection and requirement.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. McGorry.
I'm wondering if it would be appropriate to ask the applicant to submit a variance for if there are 2 under 400 square foot apartments there, to submit that as part of this and maybe table this application so we can consider both of them at the same time.
Chairman, this is Mr. Sprouse. Would it make sense? We have had discussion about combining these 2 smaller units. They share a common wall, and I guess would it make sense for us to pull a permit, combine these 2 units so that they're all over 400 at that point, and then proceed with the application?
If they're all over 400, that would seem to solve that problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I would think that would be well received by the Planning Commission, Mr. Sprouse.
Okay. Then I guess we would ask.
Go ahead.
I was going to say we can ask to table this application and look into those other steps or options if that makes sense.
Mr. Chair?
It feels like it does. Who is speaking now?
This is Connor Whalen.
Oh, Mr. Whalen.
I was just sitting here thinking, I kind of was wondering if those two were near each other. I'm glad to hear they are. And if that's their plans, would it make more sense? Could we even put in there? Because to me, it seems like it would have to go for the occupancy permit because it's changing use. I mean, I disagree that they couldn't overdo 30 days over and over again. It's still a different situation. The tenant and the renter are not protected in the same way under 30-day leases. So I think that they are going to have to go for the occupancy permit either way, in which case it doesn't make sense for us to do anything other than just approve the conditional use and then have building department confirm that they have 400 square foot units. Just my thoughts.
Thank you. Ms. Castillo, were you raising your hand or just frustrated by the feedback?
Yes, sorry. I was frustrated about the feedback. I couldn't hear. I was going to put it in the chat to say, could everybody mute? Because I can't make out what Connor's saying, but I heard him there at the end, so.
What is the preference of the commission?
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Castillo.
I would be in support of moving forward with the combining of the 2 smaller units. I'm also a little bit concerned if there's like a 300 square foot unit that doesn't seem like it's up to par for a permanent residential space. but combining them would solve that problem for me, and I would support moving forward.
Mr. Chairman, I would do that too. I would agree with Ms. Castillo. However, the applicant has suggested that they're okay with tabling this. So rather than constrain the applicant and make him approve this and force him to combine them, I would make a motion to suspend debate and take it up at the next meeting to give them time to consider their options and maybe amend the application. And it might well be, for combining units, but it might be something else.
Mr. Zoloff, would you mind if I construed that as a motion to continue?
Sure. I think I said I would make the motion. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's a motion.
Thank you. There's a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second that motion, Mr. Chairman. McGorry.
Thank you, Mr. McGorry. Ms. Brony, would you call the roll on the motion to continue the discussion?
Yes. Mr. Murray?
Yes.
Mr. McGorry?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Mr. Jackson?
Yeah.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Castillo?
Yes.
The motion, that discussion and the motion are continued until our next meeting. Mr. Strauss, thank you for your time tonight. I know you've been here for a long time.
Thank you.
I did want to let you know I've always admired that building as I sat over at Toff's and ate my ice cream. It's a very pretty front to that building, and I hope you make something of it, and I hope you come back to the commission next month with a revised plan. I sense a lot of openness to that, and
Great.
We'll take a look then. Okay.
Thank
sir.
you. Appreciate your time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sean Sprout.
Is now
Okay.
exiting.
That was good how that turned out. Ms. Brony, we have two comments.
You're welcome, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I acknowledged it. Ms. Brony, we have two comments that I understand are to be read and also have been distributed to the commission encouraging overlay districts in two different parts of the city. Would you present those, please?
Yes. The first one is from Mr. Jim Maldonado, who resides at 6911 Patton Track Road in Sandusky. He states, my name is Jim Maldonado, and I own and I am rehabbing a residence at 3328 West Monroe Street in Sandusky. I have been a union carpenter for 21 years, and I own 10 rental properties, including the residence I am rehabbing on West Monroe Street. I am writing to you now requesting an appearance before the Sandusky City Planning Commission to explain my goal of renting my West Monroe Street property on a transient or vacation rental basis. I believe allowing vacation rentals along the Bayshore corridor of West Monroe Street and adjoining side streets is an opportunity worth pursuing, both for the individual property owners and the city itself. Although I might secure this opportunity for my own property through a variance or zoning change if approved, I believe a transit rental overlay district, much as was done in the Cove District, may be better way to go. To gauge interest among other property owners in the proposed area, starting in July 2020, I mailed out approximately 200 copies of the attached letter. I have had some negative feedback, mostly from older property owners, but an amazing amount of positive feedback and interest in this concept. Once I present my idea as set forth above to the Planning Commission, I am further requesting that a public hearing be scheduled as soon as possible before the Planning Commission to obtain public input to my idea to allow transient rental of real estate in the Bayshore corridor area of West Monroe Street. I look forward to hearing back from the city as soon as possible with an answer to my request.
Thank you. And there's a second letter.
Yes, the second letter comes from David and Suzanne Stuck. They reside at 922 West Adams Street in Sandusky. Well, that's their primary residence, they state. In their letter, they state, "My wife Suzanne and I are the current owners of the properties located at 414 McDonough Street and 418 McDonough Street in downtown Sandusky. We purchased the 414 property in 2018 as a short sale, as it was in foreclosure and on the verge of demolition. We have spent the last 2 years renovating the house, garage, and grounds and are very proud of the transformation the property has taken. Similar renovations are currently in progress with the 418 property, which was purchased in 2020. This property is a duplex. My 88-year-old mother currently resides in the downstairs apartment. We have moved forward with renovations to the upstairs apartment as well as improvements to the exterior of the building. Our intended use for the properties is transient rental. 414 being the whole house and 418 being the upstairs apartment only. In discussions with the city manager, Eric Whoopser, it is our understanding that a rezoning of the area where our properties are located is possible, providing we have the agreement of our fellow neighbors. Please know that our primary residence is located at 922 West Adams Street and is adjacent and accessible to the properties as depicted below. Ample off-street parking is available for both properties. We look forward to working with the city in order to proceed with rezoning of our properties, whether via an overlay district or a zoning variance for the properties that would allow us to proceed with our intended use. As lifelong citizens of Sandusky, my wife and I are excited with the current path our city has taken with its continued growth, both commercially and economically. We are very proud of our city and look forward to the opportunity to participate in its growth as we welcome visitors to the area and to our homes.
Thank you. Commissioners, I will say that I am open to giving consideration to holding a hearing to receive feedback about the proposals that are suggested. I'd like a little bit of guidance from staff as to how that would be put in motion. But I will also at the same time say I have some concerns about the fact that we are short-staffed in the planning commission or planning department at the moment. And I am extraordinarily reluctant to hold a hearing where we can't, on something like this that could solicit a significant amount of feedback. I'm very reluctant to hold that hearing when we cannot meet in person.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Zulaw.
I thought because it's zoning code stuff that we had no choice but to hold a hearing before it takes legislation. We have to recommend legislation to city commission and we have to hold a hearing and then city commission has to do the same, I thought.
Well, I mean, I agree.
I could be wrong.
I think we have to hold a hearing. I just don't like the idea of holding a hearing in this format.
Yes, I understand.
Mr. Chairman, when do you think you're going to hear back with some thought about regular meetings? Are you expecting that soon?
I'm going to guess that in another month we'll probably have some clarity about when that's going to be, but I don't know that I don't expect that in another month we'll be meeting regularly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Based upon the guidance that I've received so far. Mr. Horstman, or maybe you could address the question of just exactly how this would be put in front of the commission. This is a public comment at this point in time indicating they would like to be able to have us consider a recommended zoning change. It's not that yet. So I take it at some point there would be a more formal application that we would have to entertain, after which we would set a hearing. Or Mr. Heil, if you want to address that as well.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'll address that quickly. And candidly, I myself was not intimately involved in these conversations, but just to give some context, the planning department regularly receives many requests over the years for people wanting to do transient rental in their neighborhood. These are two residents who have expressed that and have taken initiative on doing so, on moving that along, and staff tries to avoid having individual applications come before the planning commission for rezoning their individual properties for transient use, as opposed to doing it in a more holistic neighborhood by neighborhood way. So I believe the intent was just to hold a type of feedback hearing to get a sense of what people in the neighborhood would want, and then potentially have a staff-led or commission-led formal rezoning application that can be a subsequent public hearing after that process as well. So if that makes sense.
Mr. Chairman, question.
Mr. Jackson has been holding his hand up for a while. Jim, you're on mute.
Yeah, I've been getting a number of complaints about the participation of individuals in the city that don't have the ability to voice their opinion on some of the things that we're making decisions on. One example, that is Mill Street. And it's what they've been told that to write a letter and the letter will be read at the meeting, but that's not like quite having them feeling that they're actually participating in the process. So yeah, it would be great that individuals could participate in the process when some of these matters come up. That's my opinion.
Thank you. McGorry.
Mr. Chairman, my question is, how does a notice of if you schedule the regular public hearing, how does that notice go out to people?
I can answer that, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Ms. Holiday.
The code requires that the notice be published once in the local newspaper, 15 days prior to the hearing, and that also 10 days prior to the hearing, a letter is sent to all of the owners of the property within the proposed boundaries of the district and within 300 feet of the proposed boundary of the district. So that would be
this would be subsequent to a formal application, correct?
Well, the code doesn't reference a formal application. It's really up to the planning commission or the city commission to determine that this is worth pursuing. And I think what you're hearing tonight is that these two residents are asking you to take that first step towards pursuing this by holding a public hearing.
I guess my question comes down to, if it were about an overlay district, what would be the dimensions or parameters, and whether that would be something that the city would suggest or whether those applicants would suggest. I think it seems to me they're both suggesting more than just their property.
Correct. And so, we are limited at the staff level here, but we could produce the boundaries of the districts that roughly coincide with the areas that these residents are referring to. So we could do that without too much burden on staff.
Okay, and I'll make one further comment, Mr. Murray. I certainly appreciate your thoughts about this would be much better in person, and I know the people that would be, as Mr. Jackson suggested, who are adamantly in favor or adamantly opposed would rather be able to present their views in person. On the other hand, I don't think we can stop the business of the city in this pandemic. So I would suggest that this could go forward, the regular notices go out, and everybody that's in favor or against would present it in writing. It's not going to be verbal, but we'd hear their thoughts one way or the other. So that would be my suggestion, just in general.
Let me respond, and I'm going to recognize Mr. Zuloff, who requested an opportunity to chime in. I was suggesting that I felt we were close to that point where we could resume public meetings. I don't know if I'm right about that. If we could have a public meeting in July or August, the way, of the sort we used to have, I would prefer to do that then. And the other thing, that's all I was saying. And then the other thing I want to point out is follow up on Mr. Horstman's suggestion. I think that the right way to go about this, and I think what happened at Mill Street is a good example of the wrong way to go about this, is something is thrown on the grill without any prep work. And I think what has to be done, if this is going to be accepted by those neighborhoods, is we have to have an informational meeting at which the staff and perhaps some of the members of this commission can receive input, have questions answered on an informal basis, because I'll tell you what, if there are people that are adamantly opposed to this and adamantly in favor of this, and they all come together in a public meeting for the first time, the amount of misinformation in that room is going to upset everyone, and we won't be able to get a good result out of that. So I think having some work done in advance to prepare folks for this, so that they all are operating from the same page, as opposed to people who, hear one thing on the internet or from a neighbor and turns out not to be true, but in the context of a public meeting, it's too hard to address those things.
Mr. Chairman, I have one last question. If somebody could refresh my memory, when the Cove Overlay District went forward, how did that get generated from the get-go? Were those individual property owners who were requesting the city to think about it, or did the city go to them, or does anybody remember?
I'll make sure we get an answer to your question. I'm going to recognize Mr. Zuloff. Mike,
okay.
You're on mute. Mike, you're on mute. Mike, you're on mute.
Mr. McGorry asked maybe somebody can answer that, and I remember quite a bit of it. I was kind of a proponent of it. There were many conversations, informal conversations between staff and this body to develop the idea and develop a consensus of what we ought to do. And that's why it worked, in my opinion. What they did not do is the staff did not, in a vacuum, design and propose a district and then take it to the neighborhood with charts and graphs with a specific proposal. It didn't go that way at all. And the boundaries on Cove changed several times before it actually got to the public hearing level and got solidified. And then they were changed actually later too, but with a lot of preparation before it went on the grill, as the chairman so aptly said. The other important thing, and the intent was really clear at the time, is these overlay districts were intended to only go where they do more good than harm. Okay, it has some appeal for transient rental, not just any old where, and the neighborhood needs the help. You don't want to do damage to a stable, healthy neighborhood that doesn't have any pressure. So you need both of those, and it needs to be contiguous. It was clear that we did not want to do this spot piecemeal everybody who asked for it, or that it should be a recognizable, logical district. So the best thing to do would be to have the public meeting without any specific boundaries and see what feedback you get. Then from that, synthesize a specific proposal, take that to the public hearing as the law requires, before you make your decision on whether to go forward. And we didn't do that with these two. We kind of got the cart before the horse, solidifying, making decisions on the boundaries before we had any input, meaningful input from the planning commission, much less the neighbors.
Except you need to determine some boundaries in order to know who to send the notices to.
Well, you can send the notices to the entire city, and roughly describe the area you're talking about, and anybody,
Okay.
anyone who's interested should be allowed to go to the meeting.
Yeah.
I just say, don't etch it in stone. Don't make it look like you have a specific proposal before you even ask the people what they think. You'll just get in trouble.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's why I was suggesting some meetings between staff and the neighborhood as an initial matter made a lot of sense, so they can start to form something out of this ball of clay.
I want to hear what they have to say too. I'd want to be there. I'd want to hear what people thought.
Mr. Whalen, were you asking us?
Yes, I was waiting. I had some comments that I wanted to share when it was my turn to do so. So first off, I'm generally in favor of these sort of districts. I think the one over on Monroe makes a lot of sense. The one on McDonough Street is a little bit random. I thought that when I saw it the first time, but my parents actually live there, and I'm guessing the neighborhood would be okay with it. To me, it makes sense that these are going to have to, because we don't want, if individuals have an ability to get their place used for transient rentals, then we don't want to see every time somebody wants to do a transient rental overlay, we don't want to have a letter that requires our once a month meeting action to make something happen. So to me, it makes sense that the staff would have to recommend this, and perhaps we should give staff some sort of guidance on what kind of threshold we would want. Like I was just kind of brainstorming here, and to me, if you as an individual wanted to propose an overlay district, or if you could get 10 to 30% of the people in that district to sign a petition, that would seem cause for a public hearing and where we would discuss it. You know, it would be brought forward. We would draw up some boundaries from that discussion and then move forward and have a vote on it. To me, that's the thing. That's what would make sense in this to me.
I like that. I saw Mr. Jackson nodding as well. That seemed a logical approach.
Yeah.
And I understand, I better understand how this is initiated now. I think that was, Mr. Horstman, or maybe it was just Mr. Holliday who answered that question or made that comment that this is not like some of the other things that we consider where we react to an application. This is something that we initiate either as a planning commission or as a city commission, and we can do so on the basis of a recommendation from staff. It seems to me that what I am hearing from those who have spoken, recognizing that not everyone has spoken, is that what we want to do potentially is to ask staff to work with some of these neighbors, come back with, the folks who are advocating this need to come back with some better, stronger indication that a significant portion of the neighborhood wants an overlay district, as opposed to, the gentleman did it in good faith, I'm sure, but if somebody sends me a letter and I don't know who the guy is and he's got some harebrained proposal, I may not read to the bottom, frankly. So the fact that he didn't get a lot of response, that isn't in and of itself sufficiently persuasive.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Zillow.
Okay, I just went through this actually because of the floodplain zoning. So without presuming to advise this commission, I'll leave that to the law director, but the code, the zoning code is clear, planning and zoning code is clear that there are 3 ways to amend the zoning code, which I think this would be like any other amendment to the zoning code, adding the overlay. Is that the city commission may propose it, in which case it needs to go back to planning for a recommendation. Planning commission may propose it, in which case it then goes to city commission. Or property owners, and I believe the word is owners, may petition for a change to the zoning code. And I don't know what petition means. I think it could be like writing a letter and asking for it. It might I don't know what the legal definition of petition is because it's not defined in the code, in the section. So I don't know if the law director wants to research that, but the way I read it is a citizen has the right to petition for the change to the code. Doesn't mean we have to encourage it, but they certainly have the right to bring it to us. If a citizen may petition the planning commission, is the way I read it, or may, I'm not quite sure on that process, but the code does say that that an owner, not any citizen, but an owner may petition.
Mr. Heil, could you give us some direction? Thank you, Mr. Zuloff.
It might take a while.
So yes, Mr. Zuloff is correct. Amendments to the zoning code, which is why we were having the discussion earlier about the flood ordinance, which is actually in our zoning code, can either be initiated by the planning commission, the legislative body, or an owner. Traditionally, amendments to the zoning code initiated by property owners are applications. And so if, a property owner makes an application, then that goes through the normal process. Does that answer your question, Mr. Zuloff, of kind of how the traditionally owners petition for changes to the?
It was less of a question than kind of an answer to the ideas of how we proceed with these ideas, because I was just pointing out that to a certain degree we're guided by the section, by the ordinance.
Correct. And I guess to the point of when the planning commission decides to proceed with actually taking this action up, the codified ordinances do lay that out. It is referred to the planning commission, you all hold a hearing, and then make a recommendation to city commission. I will say that to the extent the city, the planning commission staff want to get feedback or have public meetings on topics, there's nothing that the code prohibits that kind of fact finding before the formal legislative process is initiated.
And Brendan, I believe, I'm going from memory now, I'm pretty sure that while the city commission must hold a hearing, that the planning commission may hold a hearing, and it's not required to hold a hearing on proposed legislation, I think.
This is Tom. That's correct.
Yes.
Okay. Good. We have enough smart people to link together tonight to get some answers to some of these questions. I appreciate all that you're doing to shape this, every single one of you. Commissioners, I am getting the sense that we're kind of moving in the same direction, which is to request that staff hold some informal meetings with the neighbors in these areas to get some feedback so that we've got some more definition to what it is that these folks are asking us to consider, and we have some better foundation for believing that the neighborhood is either supportive or opposes these overlay districts. Is that fair?
I would agree with that, McGorry.
Yeah.
No, it's fair by me.
I think we have a consensus.
We have a consensus.
Agreed.
I think it might be unanimous consensus.
And thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the commission for that direction, and we'll be happy to move in that direction. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I think that was our last item of business. Is there anything else for the good of the order? Thank you all for the excellent discussions. And I'm going to have to make sure that I bring a snack bar to these meetings in the future. Would someone care to make a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
We stand adjourned. Thank you. Good night, all.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Good night, everybody.
President's on at 9.